The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. I am your host, Andy Baker, and on this short episode, I thought I would go into some detail around empathy. One of the things that I know I potentially nag many of my learners about, and I often talk about in various different courses, is empathy. I find empathy a fascinating subject. I think it is the true nature of human connection. I think it is vital for us to engage with each other and to be a social species. But it's commonly misunderstood, and I think it's complex. And there's such a diverse range of what empathy is. So I don't have the kind of concept of good and evil in maybe the way that typically people would when it comes to people's behavior. I tend to look at it, and it's a very interesting concept that I came across, which is levels of empathy. That some people are very high in empathy, and therefore they tend to be very, socially adaptive. And some people are really poor with their empathy. They don't care about others, and that is going to potentially lead to them acting in ways that are not beneficial for other people. So it's not the good and bad, I think, is an interesting kind of, is a dichotomy I don't necessarily agree with. So let's go into a little bit of kind of understanding what empathy is and exploring some of the complexities of it. So there's a few different theories about empathy. One is that there's two elements of empathy, and one is kind of, and I can never quite remember the names of these and the proper names, but one is the cognitive empathy and one is the kind of the emotional empathy. That's the way I'll describe it, I think is a good way of doing it. The cognitive empathy is the ability to recognize emotions in others. So just to summarize, I suppose the definition of empathy is maybe the ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and see the world through their eyes. So it's to understand their experiences on an emotional level. So maybe that's the best way of describing what empathy is, feeling with a person. So if we look at the difference between then emotional and cognitive empathy is the ability to recognize those emotions in somebody else, whereas the emotional empathy is feeling those emotions ourselves. Okay, so maybe that's the two between. So there is a theory, and it is just a theory, and I don't know how much I agree with it, and I haven't explored it in massive detail. The definition of what we refer to as a psychopath or psychopathy is potentially individuals who are high in cognitive empathy, but low in the emotional empathy. So I recognize the emotions in others, I just don't feel them myself, so I don't care. So although I am empathetic, I can recognize the emotions and therefore adjust my behavior accordingly to some degree. I don't feel them myself, so therefore I don't connect with them in that very human way. Okay, and that's not to. I know there are many people out there who would potentially get a diagnosis of psychopaths that aren't your typical kind of, or what people perceive as serial killers. There's many high-level CEOs and things like that don't have that same, but they act as good people. It doesn't necessarily mean just because you don't have that emotional empathy that you then immediately behave badly towards others in all realms of life or in all circumstances. But I think that's an interesting concept. Because there is the other theory, which is those who are neurodivergent or would meet the criteria of potentially being on the autistic spectrum. One of the theories for them, or there's a misnomer, there's a falsehood for many people with autism don't experience empathy, which is massively untrue. They experience huge levels of empathy. What the theory around this, on this side of things, is that actually they are high in the emotional empathy, so they feel the feelings, they just don't necessarily recognize them as we'd typically expect to do to some degree or another. So when it can be explicitly understood, when they can understand what a person's feeling and that recognizing the emotion and they understand it, then they feel massive levels of empathy. There's another theory as well, which goes a little bit further, and it refers to three elements of empathy. So empathy is my ability to recognize emotions in you. That's one part of the triangle, recognize emotions in others. The second part of the triangle is the ability to adjust my behavior accordingly. And the third part is also then feeling those emotions myself. Okay, so that breaks it into three this time. The ability to recognize, the ability to adjust my behavior accordingly, and the ability to feel those emotions myself. Some of you watching this and some of you listening to this may have heard of, or people referring themselves as empaths. So empaths, I think, are very high in the feeling emotions of others. They absorb the emotions of the room. They're highly social. But sometimes it comes across in a strange way, because you immediately think if somebody talks about themselves as being an empath, or you recognize somebody being empathic, or they're high in empathy, that then they would be thoroughly kind of connective and empathic towards other people and things like that. I think I've come across many individuals who are empaths. They absorb the emotions of others, but because that can be so overwhelming for them, because, you know, if they're in a room with me and I'm sad, their whole self becomes sad with me, and that can feel really hard and emotionally draining. Imagine just feeling the emotions of other people in a room all the time. That must be exhausting. So some individuals who feel they are empaths then kind of almost have to find ways of shutting themselves off and shutting themselves down from those emotions to protect themselves, because otherwise they'd be emotionally exhausted at the end of the day. So they feel it so much that they actually have to switch the empathy off to some degree. So I think that's quite an interesting concept as well. As far as that somebody that is actually hugely empathic, it may just be it's all too much for them. So they come across as non-empathic purely because they're protecting themselves, or they're having to be boundaried in that moment, or they're exhausted from showing empathy towards others. Let me just expand on maybe why this is important within the care sector, because obviously all that's a little bit on different theories around empathy, and I find them interesting, and I don't feel I know enough to kind of fully put my my hat in any one camp related to understanding empathy. But what I do know is that empathy is so beneficial for human connection. In every behavioral management theory that I've ever kind of looked at, if I see the letter E in an acronym, it'll tend to refer to empathy. So whether it be the spell framework, whether it be the PACE model, whether it be the LEAPS model, you know, there is loads of different ones. And if there's an E, it tends to be empathy based. The reason for this is it's very difficult to be angry with somebody who's desperately trying to understand you. Not impossible. Some seem to still manage it, but it is much, much harder to feel angry with somebody who's trying to understand you. And that's really what empathy is. I'm trying to understand you and your feelings. I think the best way to understand empathy was actually taken from a lady called Brené Brown, and I highly recommend the work of Brené Brown. She's written, I think it's 3 books. She's got TED Talks. There's a Netflix special with her as well. She really has some wonderful she's done some amazing research, and she's a very eloquent and funny lady. She uses an analogy which I found quite impactful, which is if you imagine a person is in a hole in the ground and it's deep and it's dark and it's cold. Now, whatever took them down there is irrelevant. They're down there nonetheless. Now, what sympathy is kind of standing at the top of the hole and kind of shouting down and going, oh, that looks rough. I feel bad for you. Or, you know, cliches. We've all been at holes in some point in our lives. Or the look on the bright side, it could be deeper. Or, you know, have you tried climbing out? These are all the things that people commonly do when especially if they feel uncomfortable with somebody showing emotion. And I think most of us have probably been in that circumstance where we maybe avoid somebody because we know they're going through a difficult time because we don't know what to say and we feel uncomfortable. Or maybe when we're meeting somebody in the street, an old friend, and they say they're actually not doing good, but you feel immediately like, oh, I wish I hadn't asked. You know, they're kind of, oh, bless. And that's about as far as you get. I always say, like, sympathy is a card. You can send somebody a card to show sympathy, which is, I feel sorry for you. Good luck with that. It is a distance. It's not a horrible thing, but it doesn't build connection. It's just a nice gesture. That's about as far as it goes. Whereas empathy is about, is that human connection. It's going round. It's connecting with whether a person is happy or sad. It doesn't matter. It's sharing in that emotion with them. So in the hole in the ground analogy, as Brené Brown refers to, empathy is about climbing down the hole with the person, being willing to feel emotionally vulnerable. So recognizing that the person is in the hole, adjusting my behavior accordingly to go in the hole with them, and being emotionally vulnerable enough to feel those emotions myself. So that triad of the different elements of empathy with that hole in the ground analogy is kind of all there. Now, even if I step towards that, I I go into the hole, I recognize that they're down there, I'm willing to go down the hole with them. Even if I don't experience those feelings 100%, it's still better than nothing. It's still a step in the right direction. I think many people avoid going in the hole, one, because what if I say the wrong thing? Or it can feel scary to feel those emotions, especially if you've been at holes in the ground in your life as well, where you know you're going to struggle. And this then leads us to, so how do we do this and why do we do this? To have that human connection, to step into the hole with the person where they feel that you are desperately trying to understand me and you are there for me, can help people to feel strong enough to climb out the hole. Standing at the top and going, come on out, is not going to work. So I had a friend who really used to struggle with depression, and you used to get people kind of going, come on out, cheer up, we'll have a good night out, we'll have a laugh, And the thing is, when you're stuck in the hole and your foot's chained to the floor in the hole, then people at the top shouting, going, come on out, is not necessarily beneficial. Whereas actually just going around and knocking on the door and saying, hey, I didn't know whether you fancied it, I just bought a movie around, don't need to talk if you don't want to, but I just fancied some company myself, so I thought you might like to kind of sit and watch something. The important bit is maybe just sometimes just being willing to sit at the bottom of the hole with them until they feel ready and comfortable to climb out, and know that they're there and supported is more beneficial than standing at the top trying to call them out. Because until you're willing to go down the hole with the person, you can't see their foot's chained to the floor, or how steep the sides are, or the fact that it's way deeper than you thought it was. You have to be willing to do that first. I'm sure many of you out there have maybe gone to somebody looking for emotional support and received nothing but advice and solutions. And by the end of it, you're thinking, I'm not thick. I didn't need to be told what to do. I just wanted to be listened to. I wanted to be understood. I wanted to just allow myself to offload it, to share this emotion with somebody else. And sometimes this person may want advice and solutions, but sometimes worth asking permission first. What do you need from me? Do you need me to just sit with you, or are you ready to climb out the hole yet? I've seen this in numerous care situations, the importance of this, whether it be connecting with a young person because the big thing with those who've experienced trauma is nobody has ever shown them empathy. How would they have learned to be empathic towards others? So it may be a case of I've got to be extra empathic to teach you this skill, because else how can you learn it? You can't just be told how to become empathic. I've got to see it in action. I've got to experience it. I've got to encourage through it. It's a very step-by-step process. But even with individuals in other circumstances, like a prime example, like in elderly care, where you've got somebody who's end of life care, distressed and upset and going to a carer going like, am I dying? And I've seen carers really struggle with knowing what to say in that moment, because they want to make it better. They want to pull the person out the hole, or they want to deny that they're in a hole in the first place. So the responses you tend to get is, no, you're fine. Come on, let's get a cup of tea. And it's like distraction and redirection and stuff like that. Or you get the kind of cliched like, oh, you're in the end. And like neither of those help. It is always connection before correction. I don't think this person wants a yes or no. If they're coming to you and saying, am I dying? They're potentially expressing, this is something I want to talk about. This is something that's upsetting me, something that's thinking about me. So they don't need the answer to the question. They are looking for somebody to come and sit in the hole with them. So rather than trying to pull them out, we might go, you seem really sad. Would you like to talk for a bit? Or is that something that's worrying you? Why don't we sit down and have a chat together for a little while? And just come and sit with me. Come and be with me in that moment. Now, the problem with empathy, it's hard. Some people are not naturally empathic, but it takes time. I think the instinct is that we want to make things better, and we want a quick solution to make things better rather than allowing this person to feel the emotions they're feeling. I think it can be a bad habit that's ingrained from scripts where we need to quickly invalidate or redirect from those emotions, because emotions are vulnerable, emotions are painful, and therefore we must stop it as quickly as possible. I think anybody who doesn't engage in empathy is a bad person. I just think sometimes it's hard to do, especially if we're in burnout and emotional fatigue and stuff, and that's something for another episode. But I think the analogy from Brené Brown around empathy is an incredibly useful way of looking at it, because if you put it into a context of maybe this person just needs you to just listen, to just get to connect before correct, or connect before resolve. The world would be a better place if we did that. And working hard to put ourselves in other people's shoes, I think is not an easy thing to do. And we all mess up sometimes, especially if we're tired or upset or going through our own stuff. So as a final thought for this, I always say with the hole in the ground analogy, and I think Brené Brown says it in hers as well, you do need to make sure you got a rope or a ladder to get yourself out that hole. And this is where the importance of then good boundaries is concerned as well, that if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I'm struggling to cope, maybe I need to. If I'm going around to see that friend and watch a movie, maybe at the end of the movie I step away and we give it a little bit longer. Or if I'm feeling I couldn't go round, I can't cope with that, then I shouldn't go round and watch the movie on that particular night. And I think for any caregivers out there, whether professional, paid or unpaid, it is being very mindful of your emotional resilience, your emotional ability in that moment to be able to empathize. So I hope you found today's episode useful.